you go to the other stuff about them planning a nuclear war, using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine, China going to war. Well, if you have a nuclear war beginning, you would be just like a meteor strike hit the West, right? If you went all out to use these weapons. And so my question is, were these FSB analysts being asked the question, would the Russian economy survive a nuclear war in which we hit them and they can't hit us back?
Sell in May and go away. Crash is king. As the sell-off in the stock market has crushed Americans' IRAs and 401ks. Morgan Stanley says all stocks inside the index are likely to see a steep downward decline. Deutsche Bank and Citi are predicting a major recession. Barron's and Lawrence Lepard betting that gold hits 3,000 in the next 2 years. Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China are looking to diversify out of U.S. dollar-denominated assets. And now Russia demanding payment for natural gas in rubles. So could this spell the end of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency? Call the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late. Patriot Gold Group has the no fee for life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the no fee for life IRA on qualifying rollovers. Call 1-800-356-4470 for a free investor guide today. And with the knowledge that Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated IRA gold dealer from 2016 to present, click on that link in the description box below. And now on with the video. And good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Jeffrey Nyquist. We've had a couple interviews before, and today we really wanted to talk about what's going on in China. Why are they cutting the wheat early? And then also some geopolitics on the food end of things coming out. We're getting some solid numbers around the world right now of what the first projected losses would be, and those will tick up. So Jeffrey, thanks for joining me. And as we were on the call earlier, we were talking about war preparations and what's happening with North Korea and China right now.
Yeah, the lockdowns, not only in Shanghai, but, a couple of weeks ago, it was more than 280 million people in other cities, and they're closing down ports, not just Shanghai. They're closing down all those parts of their economy and all those cities that produce things for the United States. United States supply chain, all the stuff you see in Walmart. They're shutting down those people, hundreds of millions of people. You probably just saw the news yesterday. They're further slicing the food that's being sent to these people who are welded into their apartments, locked in. Please don't let them out on the street. They're not allowed to go to the store. Goodness knows if they're getting adequate food deliveries. You hear people howling from their balconies of these giant apartment buildings in China. And they're claiming they're doing it because they're doing it because they have a zero tolerance for COVID. It's bizarre.
Zero tolerance for the United States and our dollar.
Yeah.
So I was looking at the ports that are closed now. Tianjin is also hitting that list where they're starting to really trickle supplies. And I'll give you a secondhand story here. A friend of mine who does deliveries and works within the Walmart, I guess, web. He doesn't actually work for Walmart, but he is a supplier to them and goes into the stores and then, does some inventory in there. Mm-hmm. He knows the main buyer for all of Walmart across the different regions. And this was specifically Southeast region, that they're closing the Walmart offices and the stores close to where this woman was working. And she said, it's good we go anyway, because in 6 months, there's going to be nothing at all coming into our stores here. Now, that verifies what you just said. And I just had that as kind of a dot over here of, how could that be that they would run out of goods? But we see the bottleneck of what, 23,000 or 21,500 ships. It's hard to keep up anymore. Mm-hmm. Waiting off of Shanghai and the entire coast of China. When you look at it, at least 25% of all ships in the world are stuck off of China right now.
Yeah, of course, they're not going anywhere.
No, they're not loading, they're not unloading. And then China needs an enormous amount of food, which I wanted to cover as well. But what do you think about happening in North Korea? They just on the bullhorn one
Yep.
afternoon, everybody go home, everybody get inside, don't ask questions, everybody go home, and everything just.
This is either a drill in pre-war or they're very close to war with us. I'm very worried about next month because look, I've been hearing for 2 years. 2 years this month is the first time I heard it in the first weeks of COVID outbreak, that China was getting ready for war against the United States and Russia was with them. I had sources from Southeast Asia that were saying that the governments in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were told to maintain cadre from the top leadership of the countries in permanent nuclear war bunkers in case the Americans caught wind of what was going on, and that Russia and China were going to be doing a series of moves leading to thunderous war. This is what my sources, and it wasn't just that source. I had a Russian source with connections high up in the Russian scientific establishment that they were getting ready for war. In fact, the source became so frightened he left the United States at that time because he thought the United States was going to be nuked, because the word was the Chinese were pushing the Russians to start the war in 2020, in the autumn of 2020. And the Russians were dragging their feet saying, we're not ready, we can't go now. There's another angle to this that's very busy. This invasion of Ukraine, which caught everybody by surprise. Peter Zian, the former Stratfor analyst, has a very interesting little data point that I've talked to other analysts, and they say, look, he's the only guy that has this information. We can't validate it, but this is what he was saying, that the US broke into the internal email communications of the Russian general staff and some of the top people in the Kremlin last autumn. And that's how they knew Russia was preparing this invasion. But here, the big surprise of almost all the analysts is that the United States and Britain and these other countries, even Germany, have rushed in to put sanctions on Russia and to help Ukraine, because there wasn't all that much love for Ukraine. We didn't do anything when Donbass got invaded, when the sanctions that were put on at that time were actually a relief to Russia, because we were only sanctioning certain oligarchs and Russian officials who don't have any money in the West anyway, for the most part. But and we actually took off the Jackson-Vanik sanctions, which really was to Russia's benefit, which was odd. That's what Obama did in December of 2016. But what's really, really odd, what Zion says is very bizarre, is that when we read the Russian military emails, top generals, this is restricted to about 12 people at the top of the Russian military. They were going to go through Ukraine. They thought they were going to go through in a week. When their forces got up to NATO's border, they were going to invade NATO using tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, tactical nuclear weapons, they're fired out of artillery. They're use short-range ballistic missiles. So they got to get up close. They got to get their whole military up to that NATO border. And that this is the only explanation I've heard as to why NATO, our usual leaders, aren't really that big on interfering with when the Russians are threatening nuclear war. Why would they not cave into that threat? Well, it's because nuclear war, they saw, would be coming anyway. What's really interesting about it is the way this meshes with what China and North Korea are doing. And there was this announcement in China days before the invasion of Ukraine, and the Russian Navy, both of them announced massive naval exercises where they were going to put all their ships to sea. And they both announced them around the same time, around the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. There was increased naval activity in Chinese ports. And then when the invasion failed, when Kiev, that first weekend, Kiev did not fall, the activity in the Chinese ports ceased. You didn't hear anything more about both navies going to sea. They haven't gone to sea. This was in February. This was around the 22nd of February. So it's like, wait a minute. Now, in a nuclear war, you send all your ships to sea, your warships, because they're vulnerable in the ports. And I had a conversation with a Chinese source 3 weeks ago, and she told me, and she has people throughout China, that Russian submarines were using Chinese naval bases. And they were using these Chinese merchant ships to play a shell game by going underneath them and escaping detection from our satellites and anti-submarine warfare detection system. So they're deploying, the Russians were moving submarines into Chinese ports and then out again. Very, very strange. And that shows real coordination. So, and we know that North Korea is part of the system. The Russians, 5 years ago, Russia doubled the track lines, the railroad track lines going from Russia into North Korea. There's this narrow border that they have there just south of Vladivostok. And they increased their number of military advisors in North Korea. The DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So it looks like a very large war preparation. And we had the victory parade on Monday in Moscow. A lot of analysts, again, expected Putin to either announce a general mobilization or to announce victory and seek some kind of, just leave the line where it is. He did neither. The war continues. No announce of a general mobilization. Everybody's kind of baffled. What is he doing? Why is this going on?
Well, I could add on to that. If you just saw the last couple of days, Chinese navies everywhere surrounding Taiwan, and they even had their Liaoning carrier to the east with their battle group out off the east coast of Taiwan, not in the strait, which would be a way to cut off resupply coming in from the Pacific Ocean. So what you just said about all the ships coming out, but I'm starting to look at that and say, wait, you got 16,000 ships a week ago, and now it's up to 20,000+ ships. And we're not talking about small fishing boats. We're talking about giant container ships, breakbark, oil tankers, and everything in between. How's that Navy going to be running through all that traffic that's out there? Because some of these maps I'm looking at, it's surrounding South Korea. The amount of traffic hanging off there is going out beyond South Korea into the sea. And the entire strait is choked off with just waiting traffic. So I'm wondering how you really in earnest get a carrier group out through that without hitting another ship. And then with all those other smaller cruisers, landing craft, et cetera, coming from Fujian province that are out in the waters as well. So, yeah, that story sounds good, but I'm looking at the real logistics on the biggest traffic jam ever in naval history ever. Multiplied by 100 or more. And then carrier groups are supposed to be just sailing through, smooth sailing, just blazing through there. It seems like we're getting a couple different storyline. But what does match is what you said when they were going to go with Russia. All the ships came out. Well, that's happening right now. Their carrier groups are out. Everything's out of the ports. And again, they're locking down Tianjin. So that's a big port up near Beijing. As far as I know, Qingdao port is still open, but everything south of Tianjin, all the way down through all the estuaries and deltas, even way down to Hong Kong and that whole Pearl River Delta area and Guangzhou, that area has been offline since the pretty much beginnings of COVID. It never really recovered. That's where we sit today. So it does look like there's a complete breakdown in everything shipping wise coming over to the US. I'm sure they'll find a route through for food, though.
Well, you probably heard the reports that China has stockpiled 67% of the world's stockpiled grain and food reserves. That China evidently has been the last few years buying up food everywhere, all over the markets, evidently preparing for this so that they can get by without needing to. Now, they don't know how long they'll need to get by, but this is a really strategic thing, because if China doesn't stockpile food before a war, 2 Indian destroyers in the Indian Ocean can cut their fuel, collapse their industrial economy, collapse their agriculture, and that would kill 500 million Chinese within, 9 months, a year? So if they've stockpiled such enormous amounts of grain, it is an indication of war. It is an indication of a planned war. And let me explain something very basic to your listeners. A lot of analysts have said there can't be a war between the United States and China because of the trade. There's too much money going back and forth. We depend on them and they depend on us, so there can't be a war. Similar argument was made 110 years ago, that there couldn't be a war between Britain and Germany, because they had such an intensive trading relationship. But again, in 1914, when World War I started and the Germans invaded Belgium, the British declared war on them. So these two countries that were so dependent on each other economically, that had such a relationship, they did go to war. So it's happened before. But here, even before an actual war, the Chinese are turning off the trade.
Dare I say, everybody seems to be working in conjunction, because you can't tell me 50 central banks all raise their rates in a single week across the planet, all in tandem. And as I've been saying, it's like a school of fish now. The governments are like a school of fish. Whatever happens planetarily, I think more governments know that the onset of this cycle is going to be much more heavy and powerful than the first anticipated 400-year cycle intensity. And suddenly there seems to be a lot more information that we're going, at least at the minimum, 2,000-year cycle intensity, which would have a lot more effects on our interplanetary magnetic field, our magnetic field here on the planet, and where our cloud cells and jet streams stay locked in or not, because of the weakening magnetosphere or electromagnetic field around our planet.
Yeah.
When that weakens, things move. So it must be something far above orders of magnitude of what was originally predicted. It does seem like it's all choreographed for me. It doesn't look random at all. Everything seems planned, especially the way since the beginning of COVID, all countries are now moving like a school of fish. One says, they all follow. And the thing that gave it away is looking at that chart the other day, 50 plus central banks all in the same week raised their rates. So they're turning off the spigot and the levers and the gears of the economy at the same time as the trade's being cut off from China.
Well, that would actually economically make sense, because if you are going to have less, you have a threat of currency collapse and runaway inflation. If you don't raise interest rates in the face of goods being cut off on large measure, you're going to have an economic problem. So I'm sure the reaction is sort of normal per what economists think. But I wanted to ask you, did you see, probably, I know you follow this, I saw that the coldest temperatures ever recorded on Earth were recorded in Antarctica here last month, yeah, in April, right? Did you see that? It was over 200 degrees negative Fahrenheit. Am I remembering that right?
No, because that would be approaching absolute zero. But it happened for multiple days in a row. That's the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't
like
by
2
the
minutes
way,
in and out. It was days, plural. And then look across the hemispheres, how many snowstorms and record blizzards catching people off guard here right now. I got 15 inches of snowfall in the Sierras, and there's just an enormous amount of unusual snowfalls. Oh, and here's another outlier. Finland just last week, every temperature station across the country was reading below freezing.
Last week,
100% of them in Finland.
Wow, in Finland.
Yeah, and that was what, first week of May.
This is here's the thing. In trying to figure out what this whole thing means, I think it's important to say that these lower temperatures in Antarctica weren't just a few degrees higher than the lowest high. It was like almost 30 degrees colder than it had ever been recorded.
Yeah, but at the same time of the year, that's the unusual thing is
April.
Going into the depths of winter.
It's going into winter. It's headed for winter, yeah.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be in the fall temperatures at that point.
Right. Yeah. It's
I mean, in the depths of winter there, yeah, I could agree. It gets really cold in Antarctica.
Yeah. And it isn't really the depth of winter yet, so what
close.
is it?
We need to get in July for that.
Yeah, and that was Vostok, Antarctica, I believe, is where they measured those temperatures. But getting back to the war thing, this will intrigue you. Have you heard of the FSB letters?
Not by FSB. Explain a little more. Maybe I know
there were an FSB analyst who was very upset, leaked letters of his own frustration with the FSB being blamed for the Russian military failures in Ukraine.
Okay, stop there. FSB, can you give us the acronym, what the words are?
Yeah, it's the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. That's a former KGB.
Okay.
So it's a former KGB. So it's the organization that Putin was in charge of before he became prime minister in 1999. So the FSB they are more than merely the domestic service like the KGB was. They also do analysis and other things. So it's they have the SVR, which is the Foreign Service, and they're both under what's called the MGB now, the Ministry of State Security, which it was called before it was called the KGB. So it's the MGB again. But anyway, this analyst, these FSB letters, which have been translated by I believe it's an American race car driver of Russian origin who has good enough Russian to translate them. What they say is this FSB analyst explains that this war in Ukraine was decided by a very small number of people and that the analysts themselves weren't even told. But here's the weird thing, and I think that even the analyst here is misunderstanding. The FSB analysts were told months and months, many moons ago, that to give analysis of what would happen to the Russian economy if there was this giant meteor strike on the Earth that wiped out the whole West. What would be the effect on the Russian economy? Would the Russian economy be able to get through it without the things that it imports from the West? Now, this is months before the Ukraine war started.
That's an interesting way to phrase it. Yeah.
It is a very interesting, and he said they did not trust us to tell us. And so we were expected with this crazy scenario of the West gets hit by this. Now, see, what's really interesting is that he's interpreting that it meant that they were referring to the sanctions that Russia would experience.
Yeah, right.
Because
that's exactly
Russia
what it
was still, until a few days ago, Russia was still getting $1 billion a day from that gas pipeline that runs through Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians have lowered the amount coming through there now a little bit, I think by a third, by 27%, 28%. But still, Russia's still getting, but this was like a total cutoff now. You go to the other stuff about them planning a nuclear war, using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine, China going to war. Well, if you have a nuclear war beginning, you would be just like a meteor strike hit the West, right? If you went all out to use these weapons. And so my question is, were these FSB analysts being asked the question, would the Russian economy survive a nuclear war in which we hit them and they can't hit us back? Right? That's
Airburst,
my
EMP. It might be even in a satellite already orbiting. We would never know.
We would never know. Yeah. Yeah. And what a lot of people don't know about nuclear war, and this was my big shock, 32 years ago when I got into studying it. I had read the Russian literature on nuclear war, and they were like, "Oh yeah, nuclear war is winnable entirely. We just have to you just have to destroy certain targets, and you can win." And I thought, that's crazy. Nuclear war would end the world. So I went and I studied the environmental study. There is no nuclear winter. It's not true. The final study on it said that you'd have to build a nuclear weapon the size of the Empire State Building that would cost you more than the gross domestic product of all the countries of the world put together. You'd have to mine uranium on the moon because there's not enough of it on the Earth to make the bomb. And then you could create nuclear winter. But these little firecrackers we got, it isn't not enough. These Krakatoa-like explosions and these meteorites that hit the Earth that could cause it, they've got the equivalent of 300 million megaton bombs. So they just have it's just not enough. Our little puny human ability to influence the climate. So, but what was really interesting to me was that when I studied the effects of fallout, it was that hydrogen bombs are clean. You air burst them, there is no fallout. Only if you ground burst them are you going to get, short-term fallout, goes away in 13 to 18 days. And then the other thing is, the fallout from a hydrogen bomb, it's so small that if you just quit smoking, you've more than compensated for the risk, the cancer risk from it. It's a very, very small increase in cancers. So, and by the way, we already experienced that with the above ground fission bomb test, those dirty fission bombs we tested in the 40s and the 50s. We had a huge increase in cancers in the 1960s, in the mid 1960s and early 70s from that, because that stuff was still coming down through the atmosphere. But anyway, so nuclear war is, and they think this way. And so my fear is what we're seeing, if you line up everything we're seeing, it looks like somebody's desperate enough to start a nuclear war. Do you think the Russians and Chinese? Now, one Chinese source said they were planning to do this in 2035. That was their long range plan to attack the West. And for some reason, they moved it up. Is that because of this grand solar minimum? Is that because of the Earth's electromagnetic field? What do you think?
Well, it's not just our planet. Everywhere you look across the solar system, there's anomalies.
Hmm.
I mean, back 2020, Pluto's atmosphere collapsed. And 6 months later, Neptune, its atmosphere reversed. The dark storm broke apart and reversed itself. And then Mars had the minerals started glowing with auroras just 6 months ago. So that's what I mean by they realize now it's a more intense cycle coming in.
Is this
So
starting in the outer planets and working its way in?
it is, yeah. That was the whole thing is, they were seeing X-rays jumping off Uranus off to the rings. And now, I don't know if you saw that just maybe 2 weeks ago, the news releases with the thermal imaging dropping in temperature so unexpectedly that they called it an ice age happening on that planet because it dropped so fast that it blew everybody's mind on how quickly the temperatures dropped. Yeah. And then, before the solar, we're coming into solar maximum several years from now, but the trough was a year longer, a year and 7 months, and they'd predicted it to be. So magnetic field from the sun was really weak. And then in turn, more, energetic particles were running down the north and south poles of Jupiter and igniting their aurora 10 to 20 times higher, more intense, where you could actually see a blue halo with your naked eye from the Earth. That's what's happening now.
From the naked eye.
Yeah, because I knew once I knew that was happening. I have binoculars and a telescope, and I live way out here in East Tennessee. It is so star crispy out here. It's like being in your own planetarium. Really, it's that bright and that clean out here, especially after a rain. A front moves through, and it's just literally twinkling stars. And then you put the binoculars on it, and wow! And then you get the telescope on it, and you're like, whoa. With something larger and intelligent design out here than we're just a very small part of, but the whole as well. We are consciousness having a human experience. And then looking at how the star field, how wide it is, it really just, there's something else greater than, us putting all of this into motion and keeping it in motion. And once you look out at that was the whole thing, is knowing that Jupiter was coming with super heavy aurora. So I took time out to go look for it. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like I just looked up. I knew it was happening. So I consciously was looking for it. And sure enough, it looked blue from the sky here on the ground. So now, what are you going to do? Is it China? Now you need to talk about China for a second, Chinese history. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go back, say 3,000 years, you cannot find a Chinese dynasty that's lasted longer than 400 years. Because these grand solar minimums wipe out food production, food growing, areas shrink, plant and harvest dates shrink. And that's a fact that a lot of people didn't know. And just even knowing that one fact about Chinese history will totally reset the way you think. Because if these grand solar minimum cycles are on a 400-year period, and Chinese dynasty collapses around 380 or 350 to 400, there's something really that syncs up there. But if we're coming out to a heavy, more powerful cycle on a 2,000 years power, that's going to really start shifting a lot of things, including what we're seeing in the other planets, then what?
Are we talking about the event that maybe is alluded to in the book Hamlet's Mill?
I don't know if it would be that. It would be in part, but they're talking about the cataclysmic disasters, on orders of magnitude that wipe it back down to, 10 million humans on the planet.
Right.
That kind of disaster coming in versus electromagnetic field changes. So you got two choices here. You can come clean with the populace and say, hey, by the way, we knew this 30 years ago. We threw global warming in your face so you wouldn't look too deeply. And by the way, it's time to start growing your food. Sorry, my bad. But can you pay your taxes next year? We need a little more money to prepare for our continuity of government. Or you just wouldn't tell people, and it would cause too much panic.